So what are the responsibilities of the federal, provincial, and municipal governments related to the Syrian refugees?
Well, the federal government does already provide significant amounts of funding for settlement services. They provide funding that helps offer English as additional language courses. For the Syrian refugees in particular, they've provided some support to help connect the Syrian refugees with housing. That's been, I think, a slower process than anyone would like, but it is certainly a logistical challenge. I mean, I guess coming where I come from and what I think, I mean, what I would argue is that, you know, we need larger investments in things like social housing in Canada anyway. We need that for Canadians, and we need that for the people who are coming here. So I do think that there's a narrow responsibility that the federal government is already trying to satisfy in terms of those direct settlement services, and we've talked a bit about that kind of first year and what the government provides in that first year. So that is happening, and those services are there. But when we talk about the federal government setting a target, an ambitious target of 25,000 Syrian refugees, originally by the end of 2015, and now this spring, you know, there are consequences for the education system because there's more people coming in. So, you know, people have talked about whether the federal government ought to be stepping in there. But I think what we need to see is that once refugees are here and they're settling, then they become Canadians. And to me, that's no longer a question of what are we doing for refugees and whose responsibility is that. It's how well do we serve the Canadian public, and what do we want for Canadians? Do we want affordable housing for Canadians? Do we want good education services for Canadians? And we need to be doing a better job of that. We're going to be bringing people to Canada because we need people to come in and help drive our economy. They're either going to come through the normal immigration stream or they're going to come as refugees. And we need to house Canadians. I mean, we see, you know, one of the questions was why are we bringing people when we haven't addressed homelessness? There is a general question there. We have to work on that. I really do believe we can't wait until one problem is solved to tackle others. But a lot of what the responsibility, in my view, of governments becomes for people once they've come here and they've gone through the initial settlement really is the responsibility that we have to all Canadians to make sure that people are housed, to make sure that people can find employment, to make sure that people can get the education they need. In some cases, that's adults who need retraining in order to be able to get the kinds of jobs that are available. In other cases, it's their children to make sure that they can, you know, have all the intellectual rewards of a good education, and then the training they need to be able to enter the workforce. So I don't know if I'm just kind of disputing the structure of the question a little bit. I mean, I think there are obviously things you need to do within that first year or two, and English as additional language training is one really important key factor there that the government needs to make sure is there. But beyond that, I really think this kind of leaks into the general question of what we want for all Canadians, and how do we make sure that those are available for Canadians who came here 4 years ago just as much as the ones who were born here.
I'll just add to that a bit. So technically, for that first year, the federal government is responsible for the government-assisted refugees that come in, for counseling services, language, short-term housing, asylum seekers who claim recognized refugees, same process. Privately sponsored refugees, it's individual Canadians who take on that responsibility to do that first year of support. There's also interest by the provinces and municipalities to ensure that these refugees successfully integrate. So in January, the province of Manitoba, for instance, offered $1.6 million into the integration services, and that was distributed over its various institutions here in Manitoba to help support. Cities across Canada have been setting up information hubs, programming, donation facilities to support that integration too. So there's all these different levels of support. One interesting thing that leads back to Lori's answer to the last question is in Manitoba for a very long time, refugees have been seen as part of the province's population building strategy. And for a while what we had was a public assurance fund for the private sponsorship, which was a deal between the federal government, the provincial government, and the municipality to to have a backup fund to ensure that private sponsors who are bringing people over had sort of this assurance that if something went wrong, they're still funding through this assurance fund to support those refugees who were brought over. This was to encourage the private sponsorship because the province, because the city, because the federal government all realized that that population building strategy of bringing refugees here is important.
What I'll add is that in addition to the distinct responsibilities of the federal government, as Daniel explained, and the provincial interest, for the municipality, for example, in addition to serving the general interest of the public, the community that lives in, for example, in Winnipeg, with permanent residents, including refugees as being one of them, there needs to be, in every municipality, the explicit attention to the needs of people who are new to their jurisdiction, refugees and immigrants. Municipalities need to be able to plan their recreational services, their service provision to the needs of newcomers. For example, we talk about, for example, simple example that I talk about is Muslim women who will not, use a public swimming pool, for example. The municipality, for example, need to be able to meet the needs of this group of people simply because they live in the municipality, they pay the taxes, they have become part of a community and enjoy every right that we enjoy in terms of living in this city. So, for example, making sure that the specific needs of refugees or immigrants who settle in the municipality's needs are included in the municipal planning process.
This is to anyone who'd like to answer. How has your work with refugees changed your outlook on life?
I think it's a very humbling process to work with refugees, and also very inspiring, and it sort of puts your own life in perspective. And one of the things I really liked about the video that you made was the, just because I was born here, my life is so different and comparable to the life of somebody else that's just like me, but happened to be born in another place. So I really thought that's very impactful, and the work that I do at Mosaic and the people that I work with are mainly not born in Canada. But almost 80% of the people I work with are not born in Canada, and it's very enriching, and it's a great learning environment.
Yeah, for me as well, I would say I've had the opportunity, or maybe privilege, I don't know, it sounds weird when you're talking about refugees and to say privilege, but to work with refugees both here in Winnipeg and in Uganda and East Africa. And so I've seen both sides. I've seen the refugee situation, but prior to refugees coming in, and seeing them here. And I think for me, what it's done is, as was said, it's a humbling experience. I do consider it a privilege, and I think in some ways it's like even with my colleagues that I work with. Likewise, I work in a very diverse work environment. There's probably colleagues that speak any number of different languages from any number of different countries, and so it's a very enriching experience that way. But in some ways it has also made me a little more angry, in that I work with these great people, I work with great families, and I see the resilience that they have and what they're doing. But then I get angrier when I maybe go on social media or I watch the news and people are talking all this nonsense and spewing fear and hatred, and that makes me really angry because I know better and I've seen the other side. And so in that way, it can be a little bit frustrating, I think, because it's almost as if you've been awoken to to humanity, to what humanity is, and and to see that maybe other people aren't quite on the same page, yeah, can be frustrating.
I'm always amazed at how resilient people are, and the stories of war and violence and trauma that I hear about in my research, I can't even tell you because it's too traumatizing. And to have gone through these terrible things and knowing what terrible things human beings can do to one another, and then to come out on the other side and be the strongest, kindest, most hardworking people that I've ever met never ceases to amaze me. And I think oftentimes too, when we talk about refugees, we tend to talk about the problems they face and not enough about the wonderful things that they contribute to our society and to ourselves as human beings. And so I'd like you to remember that as well.
Okay, could we have another question if anybody has one?
What happens if the refugees come illegally? Like, what are the consequences?
So what happens if the refugees come illegally, is what you said?
Okay, so this is a really interesting question. So as I said at the very beginning, states have control of their borders and they decide who to admit and who to exclude. One of the ways they do that is certain countries, they say you need a visa to come in, or we're not going to let people come in, or affordability, all these different things. And they make it so that people from certain countries have no access to Canada legally. There's no way for certain people to come here to claim asylum. So they've signed the International Refugee Convention. Canada has said, we will not send back someone who meets the refugee definition and reaches our borders. Canada has brought that international obligation into our domestic law in the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act. It says the same thing. But at the same time, Canada controls its borders and prevents certain people from coming in. So another thing that the Refugee Convention says is we will not punish people for coming into Canada illegally to claim asylum. So basically, when someone comes into Canada and says, I'm a refugee, they go through the Immigration and Refugee Protection Board and they determine their refugee status, there should be no consequence to them entering illegally, to not having documentation. Some of the things that governments do sometimes sort of send this message a little askew in terms of cracking down on human smuggling. On the one side, smuggling is bad. On the one side, you don't want people getting into rickety boats and trying to cross borders. You want to control people entering your country. You want to know who's here. But if you don't let them in any other way, how else are they supposed to access protection? But the basic framework is that if a refugee comes to Canada, it does not matter whether they come by boat, by foot, by plane, legally or illegally. What matters is whether they meet that refugee definition.
Like there, that girl right there.
If there's anything you could do to improve or change the Canadian system in accepting refugees, what would you do? What would you propose could be done differently?
So the question was, can you make, if you could make any changes to the system, what would you change to either make it better or make it more secure? So what would you do to change the Canadian system for allowing refugees to come to Canada?
I'm not a lawyer, but I also know that the Syrian situation is a bit different. The average refugee has to wait more than 7 years to get here. That's terrible. Like, think about 7 years of your life. You know, you could be 5 years old and potentially in kindergarten, but most of these kids won't be in school at all. And they've got to wait 7 years till they're 12 years old to come to a place like Canada. That's like your childhood. And if you're not going to school, you're not learning. And when you get to a new place like Canada, you're in big trouble because then you're far behind. You're 12 years old and you can't read or write or do arithmetic. And you somehow have to learn all of this stuff and learn a new language and learn a new culture in half the time that it takes for you guys to go to school.
What I'll say is that the majority of the refugees in the world are hosted in countries that are very poor themselves. Think of Lebanon, which is much smaller than the province of Manitoba, hosting almost 1 million refugees. Think of Kenya, which is such a small country, hosting more than 1 million refugees. Jordan, such a small country, hosting more than 1 million refugees. So in our countries in the West, first of all, number one, as Matt talked about, we have the moral responsibility. Number two, we, as Daniel talked about, because some of our planes were bombing some of those countries, we engage in business in countries that contribute to conflict sometimes. We have an obligation to provide protection to refugees. So, in our system, we shouldn't be clapping for ourselves and patting our backs because we have taken such a small number. Small countries that have very poor economies are providing for large number of refugees. So, to what can be done to change what Canada does in terms of protecting refugees? We should work hard to accept more refugees. We have such a vast land. We have such a vast potential. We have such a vast number of Canadian people who are openly and cheeringly saying, we would like to have more refugees here because they enrich our society economically, culturally, and everything. So we need to have our governments at the federal level to be responsive, to be able to resettle more and more refugees by changing its policies, by being able to, presenting a different outlook at the global level in terms of how we process refugees, by investing more resources at Canadian visa posts in other countries. Right now, in Nairobi, for example, it takes minimum 48 months to process a refugee because Nairobi visa post, the Canadian embassy in Nairobi, is responsible for 19 countries in Eastern Africa, and they process, all those 19 countries host more than 200,000 refugees that need to be resettled, and those two visa officers in the visa post take 4 years to process refugees. So we should be investing resources upfront making policies to invest upfront in visa posts so that we have more visa officers who are still refugees. But at the same time, policy-wise from Canada, we should be able to think about the idea that we are this country that's very progressive and we would like to welcome more refugees.
Can I just quickly jump in a little bit too? I think what we need to remember is, when the government says they're going to, bring 25,000 Syrian refugees here, I think that's fantastic. That's great, and it really sort of galvanized the community of Winnipeg and in Greater Canada. People are very behind that. We have people going to the airport, and refugees welcome, all that kind of stuff. That's all very great stuff. But from my perspective, that's maybe the first stage in a very lengthy settlement process. And I think just to bring refugees here is fantastic, but I think to not then provide the resources required to support those families upon their settlement, be that 2 to 5, 6 years, I think we're doing them a disservice. So I think supporting programs in the country of settlement or in the city of settlement, so such as in Winnipeg, I think there's an obligation not only to bring refugees here, but then there's an obligation to make sure that we set them up to succeed.
So if anybody does have a question in the crowd, it's a huge audience. Ask a question.
Yeah.
So.
So I have to leave right now because I have class, but I want to ask you a question. I'm worried about urbanization. Like, a lot of people, they move to cities from like small towns and villages. Do refugees move like straight to the cities, or like they go to smaller towns like Brandon or like Dauphin or something like that? Like, do you know about Manitoba?
So the distribution of refugees.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
MCC Manitoba last year sent refugees to the following towns: Altona. A total of 35 Syrians were sponsored to go to Altona. 21 people have already arrived, so waiting for another family. No, 24 have arrived, waiting for another 11. People have gone to Carmen, to Brandon, even all the way to Flin Flon. So just to get the picture. So refugees have been going all over the province as far as MCC Manitoba is concerned.
Okay. Thank you.
Alberta did it 20 years ago. They did an experiment, and they sent former Yugoslavian refugees across the province, and it was quite successful. They sent them to places where there was job shortages, so the refugees who went there found work right away. And so now Manitoba does the same thing, and so does Saskatchewan, and we're about the only 3 provinces that have a provincial effort to try to direct refugees away from the larger cities.
While we say that also, refugees, when they settle in a new country, they are looking for a place where they can have social capital. It's advisable for people to be able to settle in a place where they will have community connection, people who have the same culture, for example, people who they can connect to. You don't want to have a family of 3, even though it would be very nice for them to settle in a small town where they don't know anyone, where they can find employment. Sometimes there could be mental health issues, if you are isolated and all these kind of things and you have gone through trauma, it could cause problems. So many of the refugees, large percentage of them, tend to move to areas, whether it's a small city or a big city, where they can find social connection with people who they know and where their social needs are met.
How do we make sure that all the refugees kind of flow in with our kind of our lives, rather than just stay in their little groups and just in their groups and just rather than adapting to kind of our lifestyle?
I think, part of that relies on you and on me. And, if you have students that come to your school that may have come here as refugees, I would put it to you that it's your responsibility to make them feel welcome and to make them feel that they belong here, and to invite them to your house, invite them to social gatherings. So there's that sort of more one-on personal aspect of it, but then I think also in a lot of the programs that we run, they are designed to help newcomers integrate into society here, and largely what that means is to learn English, yes, to understand the laws that we have here and all that kind of stuff, yes, to help them find employment, all that kind of stuff, will help them integrate into society here. But we also do encourage people. Obviously, Winnipeg is a very multicultural city, and we don't want people to abandon who they are either, right? And so it's important for people to keep their identity as however they define themselves or identify themselves. But I think things like learning English, job creation, just if your neighbor across the street is a newcomer, invite them in for a dinner. I went to an event at the Central Mosque on Ellis a little while back, which was designed sort of as the opposite. It was the mosque opening its doors to people like me. And it was a great event. It was, I would say that the vast majority of people in there, from what I gathered, were probably not Muslim. And so that's a great way, it's about community building, and that's one of the ways to build community, is to do that kind of stuff.
I think we need to take advantage of the fact that people do want to welcome newcomers, and we need to create those welcoming opportunities for people. Around the language training, the federal government provides language training free of charge for permanent residents, and there is no time limit for that. So if somebody has a literacy level and they can stay for years and build their language skills, the moment they become a Canadian citizen, however, they become ineligible for those federal programs. And so we try and encourage people as much as possible to get the language training and not to get their citizenship right away before they become more fluent, so that they can integrate faster.
Madeline, you have a question?
Once the vast majority of the refugees are resettled in different countries, what happens to Syria itself?
To the country itself.
What happens to Syria once the refugees have all settled other places?
It's a good question, and it's a scary question, and it's a sad question. And I think if you ask the Syrian refugees, most of them would hope that their country survives and they're ultimately maybe able to return home. I think that's the other thing we have to recognize with refugees is they're looking for protection, they're looking for safety, they're looking to start their lives over, but no one wants to have to flee their home. No one has to leave their home and their community and everything else. And so I think for a lot of people, that idea of eventual return and a return to normalcy in their country, it's really quite disturbing to see how fast Syria plummeted into a different reality.
I'd also like to add that the average refugee situation lasts 23 years. So the longer it lasts, the harder it is to go back. And so you have examples where people are trying to rebuild. So Kosovo and that area in Europe, the conflict didn't last as long, and people found it a little bit easier to go back. But that doesn't mean that people don't go back. So you have situations like Afghanistan, which is a bit more challenging, but people are still returning to try to rebuild the country. And it generally takes a small group of people to move back to kind of get things started. And then more and more people will come back when opportunities arise.
So, for example, in my own country of origin, Somalia, it was emptied of people from the start of the war until up to 2000. Many people are settled in different countries. Many refugees in Kenya, Uganda, Ethiopia, Yemen, all these countries. And many of them who came to countries like Canada have always entertained the idea of going back home and saying that I'm going to go back to rebuild my country. We're going to go back. Some have gone back, but many continue to entertain that. The situation is not changing, and if the situation of conflict lasts longer, then the people establish roots here, and the likability of them returning home diminishes, and it impacts the number of people who will have helped that country to rebuild and bring ideas from other countries and this kind of stuff.
Ryan.
Okay, what is the process for allowing orphan refugees to come to the country?
Or orphans.
I don't have a lot of information, but I can answer my experience because we've recently worked with some orphan refugees who we brought from Saudi Arabia. So, Shona, maybe if you can answer unaccompanied minors and stuff, do you have that idea in your work in status determination? Okay, so I'll give you, let me just speak to what I know in terms of supporting these orphan refugees. Two things. I've had situations where I've worked with refugee claimants who are under the age of 18, who don't have family members, who have come to Canada and are seeking, making refugee claim and are seeking protection in Canada. In those situations, the Immigration and Refugee Board has put them through the system to hear the cases, while at the same time we've brought them to the Child and Family Services, who apprehended them and put them as wards of CFS until they become over the age of majority to be able to live on their own. These 4 people who make refugee claim in the country. For orphan refugees, we recently had 11 orphan kids that we sponsored from Saudi Arabia whose parents had died, who are Somali refugees, through Hospitality House. And when they get here, it's very problematic because, you know, there are a couple of things. As a sponsor, we signed to be able to support these kids for 1 year. So that's good. And that we are meeting it. The other thing is that every child here in Canada, so long as they have a certain level of income, the child is entitled to a certain amount of money from the federal government called child tax benefits. Because there are no parents, then, and all the orphan kids, the oldest is 16 years, then it becomes problematic for how they access those child tax benefits so that the kids can have good life like any other kid. So that's been problematic for us in terms of supporting these kids. The other thing is also in terms of private sponsored kids who are orphans, then the CFS, Child and Family Services, and the Child Protection Authorities do not actually intervene until the 1 year is done because it's their responsibility of the sponsor to be able to take care of them. That's what we have encountered. And it's in this way, then it's possible that the child's needs as for a parent and all these kind of things, a guardian is not met until you're able to find a guardian and CFS is involved, which normally happen, which has been problematic for us because it's likely to happen next year.
Well, I think Abdi underestimated himself, so he answered the question. As far as private sponsorship is concerned, as Abdi mentioned, the legal responsibility is for 1 year, but this is the legal responsibility, but sometimes sponsoring groups will tell you that the legal responsibility is one thing, but the moral responsibility is another thing. So private sponsors have been sometimes found themselves in situations where they are helping newcomers for 3, 4, 5 years, as long as it is needed. So so those are I cannot speak for those who were brought here by the government, were sponsored by the government. I don't know what happened with them, but for the privately sponsored refugees, so the sponsors would stick around until as long as they think their help is needed.
Have Syrian refugees here, and we have my question was kind of just, we have other refugees as well, and so it's kind of a two-part thing. One is the Syrian one is in the media. Is the fact that we're accepting so many Syrian refugees, is that closing the door at all for refugees from elsewhere? And the second part would be, where are the other refugees coming from primarily?
Well, I can speak a little bit at least to the government-assisted refugees as far as the youth are concerned. So at Need Center where I work, we run an intro program for children and youth. So it's a program where as soon as they arrive in Winnipeg, maybe 2 days later, we'll see them in our intro program. And it's sort of it's an intro program that helps prepare them for what life will be like here in Canada before they start going to school. And so in that program, we will see pretty much every government-assisted refugee, child and youth that have come to Winnipeg. And so I would say back in February, January, February into March, all we had were Syrian children and youth, and we had about 90 or something like this. Now they've all transitioned out, and they're all in schools. And so now we're getting back to what we would call the norm for us, which would be, we're seeing, now we have pockets of Congolese, of Eritrean, of Somali. I would say those Congolese, Eritrean, and Somali, a little bit of kids from Burundi. Those are have been our mainstays, along with Iraq and Syria. Those have kind of been our top 5-ish countries of origin for the last 2 to 3 years, I would say.
The Syrian crisis, the enormity of it, triggered a targeted response. And it, in some ways, took a little too long to trigger that response. I mean, Alan Kurdi's body washed up on the shore, I think, just 8 months ago. And when that happened, I'd been in conversations for 2 years where people kept saying, why aren't we responding to the Syrians like we did to the Indo-Chinese in the 70s? What's different now that isn't creating this targeted response? And it's been really unbelievable as someone who's been working on resettlement for years to see communities come together to get these sort of requests to do talks and people interested in wanting to learn more, and this focus on Syria, which is necessary, but in terms of the bigger picture, the hope is really that this increased awareness for refugees expands outwards, that the new sponsors who are doing private sponsorships for the first time will continue to do more sponsorship of other refugee groups. The need for protection will be recognized more broadly again. And in terms of the government numbers, how they do it, the intention of Canada's resettlement program is always for it to be a globalized program. And so Syria's been this targeted thing, and I don't think we quite know yet how they're going to sort of reorient after that, but it'll be interesting to see. And one of the real pushes with organizations like the Canadian Council for Refugees and others speaking on these issues is really to reassert that need for a global response to refugees overall and not just the Syrian focus moving forward.
First of all, how do we balance our aim to help the people in need of refuge while keeping our citizens and borders safe from those who wish to harm us?
I'm going to go ahead with this one because this is a common question. And first of all, we need to understand that the idea that refugees are somehow coming here to commit crime is absolutely false. And in fact, you want people in your neighborhood to be immigrants and refugees because researchers have found that the more immigrants and refugees you have living in your neighborhood, the lower the rate of crime is. All kinds of crime, from theft to violent crime, it all goes down by about 3 times actually. And the reason for this is that all immigrants and all refugees have to be screened for criminal background before they get here. So if you've committed a crime, you've stolen something, then your chances of getting to a country like Canada are very, very slim. And so, you know, you're screening for people for these backgrounds already. You also hear, though, in the news, they make assumptions about things that aren't very true at all. So maybe you heard about the attacks that happened in Germany over New Year's. There was people who were groped and their pockets were picked and, you know, stuff was stolen. Immediately, the Syrian refugees were to blame. Well, it turns out, actually, that none of them were Syrian. And in fact, most of them, if not all of the people who were caught doing this, were born in Germany. But we're left with this idea that, you know, newcomers are somehow threats to our security. If that's not enough of an example for you, if we look at the United States, they keep better track of these kinds of things than Canada does. In the 10 years after the 9/11 attacks in the United States, the Americans let in 725,000 refugees. 12 of them were deported, and none of them were deported for any kind of terrorist activities. So 12 out of 725,000. That's a pretty good track record of screening people for criminal tendencies. You know, refugees are safe people. Do we have examples of some refugees doing some bad things? Yes, but they're very, very, very few and far between.
I just add, refugees are fleeing violence. And in terms of people who do want to harm us, there would be easier ways to get to Canada than claiming refugee status or hoping to be that less than 1% who make it here for resettlement. I mean, there are airplanes arriving at our airports by the minute, and most people on those airplanes coming from various countries don't even need visas to come here and visit, because we have an economy based on tourism and visitors, and all those visitors come in and pour in, And we have a lot less knowledge in terms of who those people are than who these refugees are that are constantly and continually screened for admission. So the sort of fear-mongering of the other is really unnecessary and incorrect.
If you don't mind, I'll just jump in on that too. I mean, I think we have a really good screening process, and that's so at a certain point you have to decide, well, if we have a really good screening process and people are going to go through that process and they come here, at a certain point you have to decide that that is safe enough. It's never a guarantee that nothing bad is going to happen. But the other alternative, if no screening process can be satisfactory, then you're saying we're never going to let anyone in. And that doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense from a moral point of view. It doesn't make sense from all the points of view that we've explored today. So if we have a good process, eventually you have to say, this is a good one and we're going to let people in. The idea that somehow people from other countries are going to be a threat is an old idea. And there's a lot of shame in Canadian history. Like, I'm part Ukrainian. Well, Ukrainians were interned during the, they were put in camps during the First World War. Then in the Second World War, we put Japanese in camps. There's no one now saying, oh, well, those Japanese are very dangerous, or those Ukrainians are dangerous, and they're more likely or prone to violence. It just so happened that at that time, those were the people who were coming over in greater numbers, and because there was a security threat, they were locked up. We need to stop repeating those same mistakes. And we need to learn that at a certain point we are capable of doing screening, and it's never an absolute guarantee, but it can be a very good guarantee or a very good level of comfort that people aren't coming here to do us harm, and that there are a lot of great reasons to accept those people. And I just don't know, like those arguments, I hear them a lot in Ottawa from certain others, right? And you just think, well, at what point would you be satisfied if you're not satisfied with what is a very good process? And at what point are you just giving voice to those same old feelings that time and time again, later on we say, geez, that was really shameful, we were wrong. Why can't we get it right in the moment? And that takes a little distance and it takes a little courage. But it's what we have to do, I think, if we want to be better people and be a better country. So I think we're called to do that.
I'm just going to add something else that I got the buzzer kicked in earlier, but there was a question about what could we do better in the refugee process. And as a lawyer, there's lots of little tidbitty things I could tell you. But the other thing I start my immigration class with is an article by a philosopher at U of T called The Case for Open Borders. And his name is Joseph Cairns, and what he does is he takes this theory of justice from another scholar, John Rawls. And what John Rawls talks about is this idea of a veil of ignorance. So what you all do is you just close your eyes and you're ignorant of who you are. You don't know if you're a man or a woman, you don't know your color, you don't know your religion, you don't know your age, you don't know your sexuality, you know nothing about yourself, including what Joseph Cairns adds to Rawls' theory of justice is you don't know where you are in the world when you're born. And what plan would you make under that veil of ignorance for an admission policy for a country? What would you want not knowing who you are? And his conclusion on all that is, in that argument, everyone would see the argument for a case for open borders entirely. And so it's just a different way of thinking about it, not from who we are sitting in this classroom in Winnipeg, in Canada right now, but not knowing who you are, where you are, and what kind of policies you would want. And we're not going to have a full open border, but I think our movement lately is to open our borders a little more loosely than they had been.
What are the moral, ethical, or cultural demands placed upon refugees upon their admission to Canada? Or another way that I actually thought of phrasing this question is, to what extent do we expect the refugees, to what extent do we expect the refugees to conform to our way of life, to our laws, to our standards, to our anticipations, to our things that we do from day to day?
Yeah, I could respond to that just in terms of parenting as an example. One of the things that we spend a lot of time on is parent education programs, and we talk about parents having to make some modifications, and also to have a place to come together with other parents and contribute what they know about parenting. And so we're not telling anybody what to do, but we want to make sure that everyone knows what the sort of legal and social norms are in Canada, to make sure that people are safe and successful parents here.
I would say, well, everybody on Canadian soil is expected to obey the laws of the land. So there's no question about it. The laws may change, but until they are changed, everybody is expected to obey them. Now, one thing I wanted to say, I don't think it is a very popular view, but as more and more people are coming to Canada from all corners of the world, the social fabric of the country is transforming, is being remade. Canada is not all Canada. Canada is not today what it has always been, and Canada is not today what it will always be. Canada will be what its people are. And as new people are arriving, the fabric is changing. This means the expectation is not, should not be put solely on the shoulders of the newcomers to adapt, but also for the community of welcoming, the welcoming community, to also realize that, yeah, we are getting neighbors here, and how do we get along with them? For example, something a few decades ago would be a big problem for you to see somebody dressed in a certain way, or to hear somebody mention that he or she is part of a certain religion. This would probably be a big problem sometime, but today it is not a problem because we have these people being our neighbors. So the expectations is kind of both ways, and as we go along, we're learning how to live together.
I'll say that while we expect a lot from refugees and newcomers to be able to conform to a certain way of life when they get here, and while there are also quite a large number of people who are caught in the idea of, our culture we don't want our culture to be polluted, we don't want them to bring their backward culture and this kind of thing. There are a large number of very progressive people in Canada who are very open to the idea of cultural transformation. Just for example, with myself, number one, I'm Somali. I lived in this country for 13 years. I'm a very, very practicing Muslim. I pray 5 times a day. I observe every Muslim ritual. Around my work, people have accommodated me. I don't eat pork. I only eat certain kinds of foods. And people, wherever I have worked, people have removed pork from all diet. People have scheduled my meetings around my prayer times. I'm not called to anything to do during Friday prayers. I go to the mosque and all this kind of. So there are many people who are very progressive in terms of welcoming people with bringing their own differences. While at the same time, on the other side, we have still quite a lot of work to do amongst our people. On the side of refugees themselves, of course, not all refugees are going to be very progressive to be able to adapt to this open culture of, you have your own culture, I have my culture, let's work together to have a transformational culture. There are people who are going to be stuck in one culture and saying that I don't want anything to do. There are very few of those people among these refugees too.
Getting the refugees here is one thing, and now as we know there are 25,000 who have been resettled to Canada. What's the process once they arrive? Where do we go from there?
Yeah, go ahead. What's the process once they arrive? If the refugees are government-sponsored refugees, they are met at the airport by a settlement worker from Welcome Place who will take them to a temporary housing situation. While there, somebody will be working on getting them a permanent apartment or house, and also make sure that they attend all the settlement sessions they need to attend, and there are, I don't know how many, but there are many settlement, what we call settlement agencies in town, providing services to the newcomers. Language training, job search training, everything, you name it. So that's the way it is. If they are privately sponsored, the private sponsoring group meets them at the airport and takes them to an apartment or a house they have already found and prepared and furnished for the refugee family, newcomer family. This is another thing. So sometimes our language slips, but once they are here, they are no longer refugees. Justin Trudeau said it on the video. Once they were out of the terminal of the airport, they are no longer refugees, they are permanent residents of Canada. But sometimes we forget, we say refugees, but I try to help myself to use the term newcomers that way. So the private group, their job is to provide a community to these people, to be their friends, to visit them, to try to console them when this is needed, and also to connect them with the settlement agencies on the ground for them to receive those services they need until they show signs that, yes, you know, we can find a job, we speak English, and then we can fly out of our own wings. So this is kind of the path. So being met at the airport by somebody, and then being connected to this settlement services, and then we take it from there.
And I would just like to point out as well, there's an important difference, I think, as well between government-assisted refugees and privately sponsored, in that the ones that come as government-assisted refugees are directly connected to resources right immediately upon their arrival. So someone from Welcome Place will meet them and they stay in transitional housing at Welcome Place. From there, the children and youth are directly funneled into Need Center, intro programming, etc. Whereas with privately sponsored refugees, the responsibility is on the sponsors to connect those families and children to resources. And so that's a big difference. So if those sponsors are not aware of programming or resources, etc., then those families are sometimes in limbo, kind of thing. So,
and I'll just add, Trudeau's promise to bring in the 25,000 government-assisted and then supported by additional privately sponsored is huge, but that doesn't mean we haven't been resettling refugees for 30, almost 40 years now, generally, and most people on this panel have been doing this for years already. And until the Syrian influx, there were, I think, about 12 to 14,000 resettled refugees coming through the GAR and PSR program yearly anyway. So there was a need for more space, more money, more personnel with the Syrians, but the basic foundational work has already been being done for almost 40 years in terms of resettling refugees and welcoming them and integrating them into this country.
There's one thing I wanted to add. Most private sponsoring groups work with an organization called Sponsorship Agreement Holder. And this is NMCC Manitoba is one of them. And there are about 100 sponsorship agreement holders throughout Canada. It is the job of the sponsorship agreement holder to train and prepare the sponsoring group in terms of what they need to do for the newcomers. For example, it is my job in Manitoba to tell all the churches that sponsor refugees through MCC to make sure you take those newcomers to the settlement services. So, and then to make sure they get those services. So there is sometimes, I believe that privately sponsored refugees do not access the services. This could happen in some cases, like community sponsorship or group of 5, but if they are working with a settlement sponsor migrant holder like MCC, they know where those services are, and then they have to take them there.
How does the private sector work with the public sector to help and sponsor the refugees?
Okay, because MCC does private sponsorship, so allow me to just briefly talk about private sponsorship. I won't be long. Private sponsorship is something of refugees is something unique to Canada. So far as I know, we are the only country with this program called private sponsorship of refugees. So other countries welcome refugees, but it is a government thing. Government brings those refugees. But in Canada, we have two groups of refugees. Those who are sponsored by the government alone, this is we call government assisted refugees, GAR, and those who are sponsored by a private group alone, and there is a group in between we call BVOR, sponsored in partnership by the government and the private group. So we are unique in this regard. Now, how do we work together? Taking aside the refugees who are sponsored 100% by the government, the two other groups, it is a partnership between the private sector and the government. So what is this partnership about? Well, the private group will either pay for the entire cost of the sponsorship, and we say cost of the sponsorship is the money we need to assist the refugee family, the newcomer family, during that 1 year of the arrival of Canada. So either the private group pays for that all by themselves, and then the government, they make sure that these people can come to Canada. Again, this takes us back to the screening process we were talking about. Okay, that's fine. You will pay for the bill. That's the private group does that. And I will make sure that these people can come to Canada. So this is the PSR program. So you can see that partnership. The second partnership is the B4 program. The government does two things. They make sure that the refugees can come to Canada. They always do that. They are the only people who can do that. And also they say, we will also assist in the financial support of the newcomers, and then the private group pays part of it. So this is the partnership. It is a cost and security thing. Canada is responsible for the security aspect of it, and then the private group may be responsible for 100% or part of the financial aspect of the sponsorship, to put it a little short.
I just wanted to add that this one additional group called refugee claimants, we make refugee claim within the country that also have, once they get here, they make their refugee claim to be able to consider a refugee and then later on be able to apply for permanent residence.
Thank you. How are the refugees housed in our city? There have been problems with housing in other cities. How do we prevent that from happening in Winnipeg?
It's been a big challenge. It's been a big challenge, as we know. But so far, MCC Manitoba has not had any private sponsoring group that was not able to find a house or an apartment for the refugees, and they know that they have to find a suitable house or apartment that that is according to Canadian standard. You wouldn't put teenagers of different sex together in the same room. So they do that. But in many cases, they have to find them a temporary accommodation first. For example, there is a family we have just welcomed last night, but they are staying at CMU, Canadian Millennium University, for a little while before we can find them a permanent housing. A few months ago, when the Syrians were arriving on very short notices, 24-hour notice, 48-hour notice, we had cases arriving without notice at all. So in some cases, so the members of the sponsoring group take people to their own houses while they are working hard on finding a permanent accommodation for them. But so far, nobody is in the street. This I can tell you.
What I'll say is that housing is a very difficult situation, as Arsenal says. It's a very difficult situation because the affordable housing plots that we have in Manitoba and elsewhere in Canada is meant for small, traditional Canadian families of 2, sometimes 1, 3 maximum, if you have exceeded the number 4. The average family size of the Syrian refugees who came in the last 6 months is a family size of 6. That family may need 3, 4 bedrooms, 5 bedrooms. Some families were 11, needing 7 bedrooms or 6 bedrooms. These housing plots are not available in the social housing sector or in the affordable housing market. So you find that housing that's available to be able to fit the needs of refugees is only available in the private market that's quite expensive. So what is the result of this? One is that refugees invest all their child tax benefits, all their income that they're supposed to use to buy food, to pay rent, and live with minimal amount of money to buy food. That's one. The other side of it is that large families end up living in 2 bedrooms, family of 6 living in 2 bedrooms in very overcrowded situations where you will have kids go to school the next day and they're yawning and sleeping in class because they were not able to sleep last night because of the overcrowded situation. So generally in terms of housing across Canada, because we are the only G8 country in the whole world that does not have a national housing strategy, we have this problem of housing across Canada. And because of this problem, refugees have a problem because they come with large families. And I normally say that while we have the interest to settle refugees here in Canada, we're not prepared for them in terms of housing and a few other needs.
If I can add also, one of the other issues I think as far as housing goes is the importance of educating families when they come here about their rights as tenants, and also sort of connecting them to housing resources. Like there's an agency called New Journey Housing, which helps newcomer families with housing related issues and helps them find housing. Many of the families that we work with, once they leave their transitional housing at Welcome Place, they'll end up in apartments or houses, and sometimes those residents can be marginal at best. I was in a house just last week that the family kept on saying stuff about the mice, and there was mouse poop littered all over the floor of the house, and they were explaining to me how there's just mice, like they're overrun by mice, and they've spoken to the landlord, but the landlord's not doing anything about it, and so, but then they're like, but we signed a year lease, so we're stuck here. So there's those types of issues where families require some guidance and support and direction to the appropriate resources that can help them sort of advocate for themselves if they're in a situation like that.
Very quickly, what can we do to help to help Syrian refugee families settle into Canada or anything like that? So what can we do to help?
What can we help with once they arrive at our schools and our communities?
Other than being welcoming.
Volunteering at a settlement organization. We have 91 volunteers at Mosaic. We're very, we rely on volunteers for a lot of the services that we provide. So it's an important way that communities can get involved.
I was just going to say this is a phenomenal start. I mean, having this conversation and this discussion and just being engaged, not only in being welcoming, but in actually addressing the issues and talking them out and sharing and speaking out is really important.
I think reaching out as an individual. So, the first time you reach out to a newcomer, they might be scared or shy and they might not be very receptive. Reach out again. Wait for a little bit of time and reach out again. Get them to know that, you're a person who cares about them. And if they do want to share with you, let them, learn a little bit about their lives. And understand that, especially with refugees, if their country had been different, they wouldn't be here. And so they're probably missing their family and their friends, and they've probably had a lot of losses in their life, not just loss of family members, but losing your home and your possessions and your future, to try to empathize with them about that. And then I think trying to be an advocate is helpful too. So anytime you hear somebody saying something that's wrong about refugees, try to give them some information that is correct, so that you try to bust some myths that are floating around. Like refugees are not terrorists, and provide them with some information about why this is the case.
So this event was extremely insightful, keeping in mind that many people, and even adults, have no idea what they're talking about. So right now, you know more than they do. So this event will help a better place. And to make this event even better, we have experts from all different domains such as law, politics, sociology, and human resources, and many more to come help educate us. So this, I would ask for a big round of applause for all. Please do not run away after the event is concluded. So in the end, we need to recognize that citizens of Canada, we are so blessed that we have a home, we have access to education, that we're safe, that we have a lot of time, we have enough to put food on the table. We have ample opportunity at our feet, but the same person halfway around the world, just as great as you are, doesn't have the same opportunity. And that's something we need to think about. So we need to be more open-minded and thoughtful, and we need to shut out and maybe educate the ignorance in some way, and take what you get from this presentation, and hopefully you learn something, because that's all that really matters. Thank you, and have a wonderful rest of the day.